Welcome to HuffPost Live. I'm Zach Carter here with Ryan Grimm, and today we are very pleased to be joined by one of the preeminent American intellectuals of the last century, MIT professor Noam Chomsky, an expert in everything from linguistics to philosophy to political science. Dr. Chomsky, thanks for joining us.
Glad to be with you.
So I wanted to start with what's going on in Congress today. The Senate is set to vote on extending long-term unemployment insurance, and it's not looking good. So what do you make of the fact that with 7% unemployment, we're looking at cutting food stamps, cutting LIHEAP, cutting unemployment insurance, and what does that tell us about our current political situation?
Now, as far as the refusal to provide very minimal living standards to people who are caught in this monstrosity, that's just pure savagery. There's no other word for
it. Now, do you think that this is a sort of a short-term problem of cruelty there with a few people in Congress who are just bad apples? Or do you see this as a product of longer-term sort of economic thinking? You know, I'm thinking back to the 1990s here when there was a lot of left-wing activism over the WTO and NAFTA, different sort of changes to the structure of the international economy.
The general and very severe problem with the economy that's staring us in the face, what I just described, that has nothing to do with bad apples in Congress. These are deep structural problems having to do with, in effect, the neoliberal assault on the population, not just of the United States, but of the world, that's taken place in the last generation. There are areas that have escaped, but it's pretty broad. It's hitting the United States in this particular way. As far as Congress is concerned, I think probably the best characterization was given by Norman Ornstein, very distinguished political analyst, conservative analyst from the American Enterprise Institute. He simply pointed out the Republican Party has no longer sees itself as a parliamentary organization. He calls it a radical insurgency, which is dedicated to undermining parliamentary processes, refusal to enter into serious negotiations, and has essentially just drifted off the spectrum. I mean, it used to be said years ago that the United States is a one-party state, the business party, with two factions, Democrats and Republicans. That's no longer true. It's still a one-party state, the business party, but now it has only one faction, and it's not Democrats, it's moderate Republicans. The so-called New Democrats, who are the dominant force in the Democratic Party, are pretty much what used to be moderate Republicans a couple of decades ago. And the rest of the Republican Party's just drifted off the spectrum.
The Trans-Pacific Partnership is something that's been getting a lot of attention in the press internationally recently, not as much at home in the States. What do you make of the TPP so far?
It's very hard to make anything of the TPP because it's been kept very secret, half secret, I should say. It's not secret from the hundreds of corporate lawyers and lobbyists who are writing the legislation. To them, it's perfectly public. They're, in fact, writing it. It's being kept secret from the population, which, of course, raises obvious questions. And we even have some answers to those questions because one part of it leaked. It was leaked and released by WikiLeaks. It's the section on intellectual property rights. And what are called intellectual property rights are simply highly protectionist measures introduced to maximize profit for pharmaceutical corporations, huge media conglomerates, and so on. It's called free trade, but that's just a joke. These are extreme, highly protectionist measures designed to undermine freedom of trade. And in fact, much of what's leaked about TPP is really indicates it's not even about trade at all. It's about investor rights.
Back in the fall, when President Obama went to Congress and asked for authorization for a serious strike, I believe you had a brief email exchange with Ryan here, in which you said you thought it was largely irrelevant that he was going to Congress and seeking approval. I'm curious, with everything that's going on in Fallujah over the weekend, the continued conflict there, and the U.S. lack of involvement. Do you still feel like that was irrelevant, or do you think that Congress is playing more of a democratic role?
I happened to be listening to the radio this morning, the NPR, as I was driving in, and there was discussion of Fallujah in an interesting way. The discussion opened by saying something like this, that American soldiers had fought and died to liberate Fallujah, but now it's turning into that might have been in vain. It's a rather odd way of describing what happened. The U.S. attack on Fallujah, especially the second one, or two, in November 2004, was a major war crime. It was really a major atrocity, one of the worst crimes of the war. And in fact, it began right away with war crimes. The Marines surrounded the region, wouldn't let men escape. The first thing they did was break into the general hospital and throw all the patients and doctors on the floor, their hands tied. There was a picture on the front page of the New York Times. It wasn't secret. When this is itself a war crime, major war crime. When asked why they did it, they said it was because the hospital was a propaganda center. It was releasing casualty figures. And then it went on to, just to quote the New York Times reporters, to trying to trace the pack rats in their warrens and kill them and so on. And nobody knows how many people were killed. Estimates run from maybe 1,000 to the Red Cross estimate of about 6,000. It was a major atrocity. It wasn't liberating Fallujah and fighting and dying for, of course, soldiers fight and die, whatever they're doing. But this was a major wartime atrocity. The whole Iraq War was a major crime, but this was maybe the worst specific crime in the war. So I think when we talk about Fallujah, we should first of all remember what in fact happened, not conceal it.
I wanted to ask you about the negotiations going on currently with Iran. There's a lot of controversy in the Senate and in Washington, and some conflict within the Democratic Party. With the White House is insisting that Democrats in Congress not push further sanctions at this moment, as it might push Iran away from the negotiating table. AIPAC is lobbying pretty hard to push Robert Menendez, the Foreign Relations Committee, to push forward with his bill that would ramp up sanctions immediately and allow the White House to put them off. But the White House is warning that this is a step closer to war. I wanted to get your reaction to this feud within the Democratic Party.
Well, my feeling is that the entire discussion is kind of surreal. There are more fundamental questions to ask, like what justification does the United States have to impose sanctions in the first place? Why? Just because we say so? I mean, as far as U.S. intelligence knows, Iran is, of course, developing nuclear capacities, but they don't know if they're trying to develop nuclear weapons or not. And chances are they're developing what's called nuclear capability, which many states have. That is the ability to move to nuclear weapons if they decide to do it. That's not a crime. In fact, even if they did develop nuclear weapons, that would be a violation of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. But we accept, in fact, support development of nuclear weapons by states that don't even sign the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Three, in fact. There are three: Israel, India, Pakistan. Israel has, nobody knows, maybe a couple hundred nuclear weapons. India has a major nuclear weapons program. Pakistan's programs, partly reaction to India's. The U.S. has strongly supported Israel's, of course. I mean, it objected in the early stages back in the 60s. But since the 70s, the U.S. supported the program. In the case of India, the Bush administration reversed congressional restrictions on support for the Indian program. Said, okay, they called it, we'll support their civilian nuclear programs, but that's a joke. That simply means they transfer the technology to nuclear weapons if they like and can release technology for that. That, of course, led Pakistan at once to try to increase its nuclear capacity. And incidentally, the nuclear program and the nuclear weapons program in Pakistan was developed during the Reagan years. The Reagan administration pretended it didn't know about them so they could keep funding Pakistan, providing military and other aid to Pakistan. Of course, they knew about it. So we're supporting these things all along. Exactly what right do we have to impose any sanctions on Iran for doing something that is not illegal by any standards?
I mean, it seems to me that what you've said in this interview is that what we've seen from the Obama administration on economic policy, on foreign policy, is really sort of more of the same that we've seen from previous presidents, going back to Bush all the way to Johnson. But I feel like culturally there have been some things that have changed significantly within the United States over the last few years, and you see that represented politically by things that, like Colorado legalizing recreational marijuana, the same-sex marriage movement that's spread to several states. I mean, what do you make of those changes, and did you expect to see them in your lifetime?
Well, I agree with you. I think there are major changes. These basically go back to the 1960s. The activism of the 1960s had a very significant kind of civilizing effect, in my view, on the whole society. In women's rights, civil rights. In later years, that became gay rights. The permitting use of marijuana, the limited use of permission, that's a step that is, in my view, should have been taken a long time ago. In fact, there's another case we should be asking: what lies behind this? Why is marijuana banned in the first place? There's an interesting history, which is pretty ugly. No time to go into it. But the fact is, maybe it's. There are much more dangerous drugs than marijuana, far more.
There's also been some interesting progress domestically, at least in the politics of the conversation of inequality. You even had former President Clinton at Mayor de Blasio's swearing in the other day, talking about inequality, which was probably pretty an unexpected development for people that knew him from the 1990s. You're seeing a lot of energy around the minimum wage and even for a kind of universal social security, a universal basic income. What do you think accounts for this newfound energy around this issue? And are you seeing a genuine change in the conversation around inequality?
I think one of the major successes of the Occupy movement was to place the issue of inequality pretty firmly on the public agenda. Of course, it had been a very serious problem that's been growing for a long time. Inequality now is at a level not seen at least since the 1920s, maybe farther back, and it's very severe. Practically all of the growth in recent years, maybe I think 95%. Has gone to the top 2% of the few percent of the population. The real wages, wages measured by, qualified by inflation, have stagnated or declined. A large part of the wage of the working population is now actually living below the poverty line. And and as we mentioned before, there are tens of millions who just can't get work or have part-time work, not real work. And meanwhile, at the very top of the wealth spectrum, there's enormous wealth concentrating. Corporate profits, as I said, were just booming, and this tremendous wealth. So sure, this is a major problem. In fact, it's even a simple economic problem. It's cutting back economic growth. These people who are, it means that ordinary people, the mass of the population, can barely consume, which of course cuts back economic growth. You mentioned the minimum wage. The minimum wage is way below what it ought to be. The minimum wage should, up and through the 1950s and 60s, the big growth period of the American economy, minimum wage pretty much tracked productivity. And so the more productivity of labor increased, the more the minimum wage increased. If that had continued, the minimum wage now would probably be, I don't know, maybe way over 2 times as high as it is. Part of the neoliberal assault was that the minimum wage in real value started declining, not growing. So as the GDP, the economy grew, and as productivity grew, the minimum wage stagnated. So it should be raised considerably, probably double or more. It's a shame that this has taken so long even to be a discussion. As for support, we may recall that the last major program for helping families that are at the level of survival was undertaken by Richard Nixon, the Earned Income Tax program, which was quite significant. And that should also be increased in many respects. Nixon was the last liberal president. In fact, many of his programs are now being dismantled or are under attack. This is what's happened in the past generation. So yes, I think it's belated and appropriate that these issues should be receiving public attention, much too little, in my opinion.
And one final question, because I know you have to go. You've always said that your activism and your academic work should be considered in separate spheres, and the two shouldn't be conflated. But I wanted to press you a little bit on that. If you think about your original intellectual achievement, which was to destroy B.F. Skinner's approach to behaviorism, there seems to be an almost kind of fascist undercurrent to where B.F. Skinner was headed, and your rebuttal to him seemed to be rooted, and correct me if I'm wrong, in kind of a unique dignity that humanity has. And it seems that from there you can pretty easily draw a line to the type of activism that you've been doing throughout your career. I just wanted to get your reaction to that.
I mean, I've been asked about it a lot. Actually, about 40 years ago, I guess, I was asked to write about language and freedom, this question. So I did write an article about language and freedom, and I started by saying, I think I have some things to say about language, and have something to say about freedom, but I don't have much to say about and, because the connection is, there is a connection of the kind that you mentioned, that's real, but it's pretty abstract. And in fact, it has there's a very interesting history about it, back to the Enlightenment. There have been attempts to link the concept of dignity of humans, fundamental creativity of the human mind, and so on, to political freedom. In fact, the classical liberalism originates with ideas of that nature. So there's something there. On the other hand, the kind of activism I've been involved in could have been carried out by somebody whose field is algebraic topology, let's say, and somebody could have exactly the views that I have on linguistics and cognitive science, and be an ultra-right supporters of every cause that I oppose. There's just no logical connection. There's a kind of a subtle connection of the kind you mentioned. I think it's real and not to be disparaged, but it doesn't lead to implications as from taking political stands to stands on the professional issues or vice versa. And I think we should keep that in mind.
All right. Well, Professor Chomsky, thanks so much for making time for us. We had a really great time talking to you.
Good talking to you.
This is HuffPost Live, where the conversation never stops.